just quickly like to introduce the panelists just so that you are aware of them. But just starting on my extreme left, I've got Matthew Rushton, who's the Deputy Managing Director of JAMS International, based in London. On his right, I've got Avi Gravila, is that right? From Romania, an experienced mediator and a pioneer in his own country, very active on this policy debate. To his right, Lord Mance, welcome, good evening, from the Supreme Court, and been hugely instrumental in policy, both at European and obviously UK level. Giuseppe, Diana Wallace, who's been very instrumental in this research, but at European level over many years. Welcome, thank you for coming along. Hazel Genn from University College London, very active on the field of rule of law and the overlap with mediation and ADR. Good evening, thank you for coming. And Bill Marsh, far right, very experienced independent mediator based in London and working at an international level on training and through the independent mediators. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's our panel for this evening. I had asked each of the panelists to start with a very short response, a couple of minutes, just an initial response and reply to the survey, which Giuseppe has very concisely summarized into 30 minutes. It was much more detail than that. So I would like to ask each of our panelists to start, and if I may suggest Lord Mance first, moving down towards my left. Lord Mance, your response to Giuseppe's report.
Thank you very much. Mediation is obviously a highly desirable means of resolving contentious issues. It's consensual, and that's the reason it empowers parties to decide their own disputes, and there's an important holistic element to it. I think just as desirable is, of course, the aim that parties should be able to resolve their disputes if they wish according to law, that is, according to their respective legal rights. And the legal aid issue has already been touched on. It's an imperative in states subject to the rule of law that this should be possible. It's a social good as well. It leads to a feeling of security in relation to current dealings and to the establishing of legal principles by decided cases by which citizens can regulate their future dealings. And I think both those aims must be encouraged to the extent that the present initiative derives from concern about access to justice through the courts, including the time, costs and the lack of legal assistance available for court proceedings. That should actually, I think, be a prior imperative concern. A mandatory obligation to resolve issues by consent is, of course, a contradiction in terms, and the most that can be done, as this report indicates, is to encourage mediation as a possible means by other ways, including by mandatory information sessions. The report's ultimate conclusion is in favour of what has been described as mitigated mandatory mediation, coupled with the idea of a balanced relationship target number. Now, I must congratulate the authors of the report on a very diligent and interesting report. Just to be a devil's advocate on one or two points which I think might merit some further attention. The assumption may be in the report that mediation is an absolute good to be encouraged as much as possible across all legal systems. I'm not wholly persuaded that that's the case because of the differences between legal systems. We've had references to the volume of cases going through the Italian courts, and the time involved can be substantial. But there are other legal systems, such as the German, which are cheap, efficient and quick. And in those systems, it may be that the need is not the same. The British legal system, as the Ministry of Justice has accepted in its February 2012 study, its conclusions in response to the consultation on the subject of described as solving disputes in the county courts, creating a simpler, quicker and more proportionate system. The British legal system has a problem of cost, and that has led the Ministry of Justice to consider quite rightly that mediation is a boon and should be encouraged, and we have encouraged it, as has been mentioned in family law, even on a compulsory basis, but in relation to small claims up to £10,000 worth, it's something to which attention is drawn, and telephone mediation is quite successful there, and I think that that could definitely be considered to be extended in other areas. The conclusion in 2012 was that it shouldn't be extended to higher value claims, but I think that is something which must be open for further discussion, and after proper consultation might well prove appropriate. The report, secondly, was I think framed exclusively in terms asking how mediation could be increased, bearing in mind the important cost implications which we've had our attention drawn to. It didn't specifically ask the experts to identify any downside there might be in resolving issues according to mediation rather than litigation, and I've already identified the possible limitations of mediation. It's not a process which leads to the resolution of disputes by reference to legal rights. And there is a social good in that possibility, resolution according to legal rights. The number of responses are quite substantial, 820. I'm not aware of what who the experts were. Clearly, they appear to have been selected, and it may be, I think again, that wider consultation is necessary and will be thought to be necessary in this country among consumer and commercial legal groups, with courts and ministries of justice before any further steps. I'm sure it would be thought necessary. Can I just finally and thirdly, as devil's advocate, make a point on the idea of a balanced relationship target number? That does appear to me a questionable proposal. For the reason I've already mentioned, really, different legal systems operate on different bases, and the report suggests that a similar percentage would be likely to be appropriate across all legal systems. I can't believe that that is likely, and I think that in some systems it might be quite inappropriate to suggest any percentage. Looking at the mediation directive, the suggestion that this is already legally implicit in the mediation directive appears to me an optimistic construction of the mediation directive, which would involve an artificial expansion of its language way beyond anything that can have been intended by the legislator. And it seems to me particularly important in the European context that we should not be putting artificial constructions on European measures. It's important for the rule of law in Europe that measures which go through the legislative process at the European level, which are carefully considered in the Council of Ministers and now with increased parliamentary involvement, are given their actual meaning. And it doesn't do any good for Europe if, and I'm not suggesting this as a criticism here, but it doesn't, if it were pursued as a point which was suggested as one which, for example, the European Court might take up, I would think it, on the face of it, very unfortunate if it did take it up, because it doesn't seem to me to bear any resemblance to what can have been intended when the mediation directive was actually agreed democratically in the Council of Ministers by those who do represent the, in the nearest fashion we have to full democracy at European level, the peoples of Europe. So that is quite a strong way of throwing doubt about the legal suggestion. As to the practical suggestion, whether it's a good practical suggestion for future legislation, I have indicated that I wonder whether it is across all legal systems in the same way, and I would not personally be minded to think that it was going to be appropriate. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for that. Eddie, may I ask you for your response, please?
Thank you for inviting me to such an important conference. It is a pleasure to be here and to come back. I miss it. maybe not the rain that much, but I like to be here very much. I am coming from Romania. You could notice the long bar in Giuseppe's charts that was coming from Romania. 200 of those experts were coming from Romania, and I can say that the study was influenced by Romanian mediators. There are 10,000 mediators in Romania authorized under a national accreditation scheme by a quality assurance body which is called the Romanian Mediation Council. It's formed by 9 mediators which are elected by term by the mediators. So you see, we have a liberal profession that is governed by the mediators, and we can make decisions. Therefore, a lot of people came into the profession. We have now about 10,000 mediators, but 9,000 or something like that. So let me give you a little bit a flavor of the numbers. In 2009, we started with a few hundred cases. In 2007 and 10, we had about 600. In 2011, we had about 2,500. And we grew 4 times each year. In 2012 we had about 10,000. Last year we had about 40,000 cases, and this year we might have about 50,000 up to 100,000 cases. And so far it appears to be a success story. But now I'm going to give you the flip of the coin. This year we have a new policy talking about mandatory information sessions for certain types of cases. We have about 3 million new cases every year, 1.5 coming back from early years, so 4.5 in total each year. We should have around about 1 million information sessions each year. The problem is that 90% is formal. So you see, the numbers are going up, but more and more of those that were indifferent are now against mediation, and that might not be a result that a policy is supposed to aim for. So one idea is that mandatory elements can certainly be a solution. But we need to be very careful with that, because any mandatory element will narrow the freedom of choice. And therefore, in order to develop any policy, I believe that we need to find a balanced solution regarding mandatory elements and continuous education. This objective will or can be part of a curriculum for our students that will become lawyers or judges and so on and so forth at European level, and probably in not more than 4 or 5 years. Mediation will come from both directions, legislative and non-legislative. The idea is that any decision will be made, as many stakeholders as possible should be taken into consideration. Again, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Matthew, from international perspective, possibly?
Well, actually, I'm going to confine myself to 2 points. And the first relates to the UK, and it seems to me that some of the underlying premise of this study is that mediation has failed, and that something has got to be done about it. I just can't really buy into that with the evidence that is around us in London, and I do take the point that we do have an entirely different legal system here. I mean, it's only really a failure, I think, if you're looking at mediation in a very particular way, and that is as a substitute for litigation. When it works effectively, as it does most of the time, mediation is entirely complementary to litigation, and it's not opposed. I can see how we tend to reach this decision. I said many times before that I think we have overtrained mediators in this country. There are far too many accredited mediators looking for work. And the result of that is that we have a very vocal number of frustrated people saying there isn't enough mediation. The other reason, I think, and it's kind of a statistical trap, and it seems to be an assumption that cases not settled will go to trial and then on to judgment. And I think that is to ignore the 96-98% of cases that settle with no other intervention. And I think that has tended to skew analysis and also skew some of the cost-saving statistics that we've been looking at. I don't think that mediation necessarily should be vast. I don't think the numbers should be in the hundreds of thousands. I think rather than comparing with cases filed, we should be looking at numbers of judgments. And perhaps it's also an interesting comparison, given the cross-border nature of the EU directive, with international arbitration. And if you look at the figures of the international arbitral institutions, they too are not huge. LCIA in the 200s, Hong Kong similarly, Singapore, the ICC up near sort of 800. They're not big numbers comparison to what we're talking. So I just don't buy the idea that mediation is failure. I think here in London is a success, and there is plenty of evidence for that. My other point that I just wanted to make is to put this discussion into an economic context. I think there is an assumption that we all have that mediation is counter-cyclical. Litigation, I think there is evidence that it was and remains counter-cyclical to a degree. But interestingly, JAMS has kept very interesting metrics for over a decade, and this includes hundreds of thousands of mediations. And what we've discovered is that those figures track very precisely the big law firms. So when their numbers are up, our numbers are up. And so on the whole, I don't think it's counter-cyclical. I think it may be the reverse. And so in 2014, following a period of unprecedented economic crisis, this might not be the right point in time to start making radical changes to policy when there could be strong and steep growth ahead without implementing any changes, simply by virtue of the economy recovering and people being more willing to experiment with different consensual methods of dispute resolution.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That's really helpful. I'm sure we'll come back to a number of those points. Diana Wallace, I think it's just important to mention just before Diana responds, but Diana's also going to be speaking at the Civil Mediation Council conference in Leeds in a couple of weeks' time, and she's actually going to be talking about this report and also the outcome of today's debate. So I think it's very grateful to have you here and for you to be able to convey that message to the CMC conference. I know Sir Alan Ward apologised for not being able to be here today. I did speak with him on Tuesday, but Paul Randolph is here representing the Civil Mediation Council, so I hope we can have comment to feedback to you as well. Thank you, Diana.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope I will be able to feed back diligently the tenor of the discussion and comments tonight. But I think what I wanted to do was to reflect slightly from my previous experience of where this all came from in the European legislature, and firstly to say, I guess, thank you to Giuseppe for reigniting the debate. I think that's a good thing to have done. But I think we should also bear in mind the context from where the mediation directive came. I looked back last night at a booklet. Well, it's more than a booklet, it's a tome that my staff put together when I left the Parliament of all my speeches and reports. And back in 2003 was the report on the Commission's Green Book on ADR. And this was where all this discussion started about the whole idea of increasing the offer of access to justice through ADR as a whole in all its diversity. And at that stage, mediation was just part of the offer. And at European level, it was about getting to grips particularly with one issue, and that is the difficulties of jurisdiction and different applicable laws across various countries. And I think that's why it was important that we were just reminded that the Mediation Directive is cross-border only. It actually only focuses on cross-border cases. It's not meant to be about domestic cases, although of course we know inevitably it has an influence on national policy as regards mediation, and I think many of us have been grateful to see what has happened. But we shouldn't be, how can I say, our expectations shouldn't be too great in that sense, because if you look at what the directive actually says, it is an encouragement to use mediation more, and it is about giving information about mediation. And I suspect that in most member states those possibilities have not been sufficiently tried, tested and exhausted before we move on to any form of mandatory means. Also, I think we should have in mind that the EU legislator has subsequently been quite busy in the area of ADR and recently produced both a new regulation and a directive on ADR and ODR. And what is interesting, if you look at that, and remember mediation is only a part of that, and although it's targeted towards consumer disputes, suddenly you have a regime that member states are asked to ensure that ADR is available, and a regime that is not limited to cross-border, it affects domestic cases only. But, so there's a contradiction there. But if I come back to where I started, I think many of us who were involved in this whole discussion about ADR at a European level saw mediation, saw other possibilities of ADR, from arbitration to adjudication to whatever, as part of a wider offer of increasing access to justice. And any of them can be valid. But again, as we've been reminded, they have to respect that justice is a public good, and we want to make sure that this is something that reflects appropriately our societal values. And that is something we also have to be very careful about, because I certainly worry in an atmosphere, particularly in London, where we see our courts almost being more sold like a commodity, our legal system advertised as our jurisdiction advertised as the best jurisdiction, as a centre for arbitration. I think we have to be very careful where we are going in terms of access to justice and what part mediation plays in that. I think it should be a part of the offer, an important part of the offer, but most important is to increase information, to ensure it is more encouraged, more widely known about, but compulsory, mandatory, I'm really not sure. I think the jury's still out.
Thank you very much, Diana. Very interesting view, and a perfect handover point to Hazel, who I know is very close on the policy side of this.
Absolutely. I was going to say that most of my best points have been made more elegantly by Lord Mance, but actually I think Diana's just done it again. I speak as somebody who is highly supportive of mediation as an option, as a supplement to the legal system. I've never been a fan of mandatory mediation. I have serious concerns about it. I also have grave concerns about the use of mediation arguments and mandatory mediation arguments in the context of access to justice. Because as I've said many times, I do not think that it is necessarily an access to justice benefit. And I think the point that you made just now, Diana, about on the one hand selling the English legal system as being absolutely fantastic to kind of foreign litigants and denying our own citizens access to justice through the removal of legal aid for civil and family disputes, and saying, well, oh, that's okay, you can go to mediation, although I don't think the government's even saying that, because I don't think they really care whether people do or not. And I just, the whole idea, some of the things that you said with respect in your presentation about the idea that mediation is a kind of access to justice, it's a kind of filling of the access to justice gap. It is not, and the economics of mediation are quite complicated. It does not fill those gaps, and actually I don't think that mandatory mediation makes kind of basket case justice systems, and I'm not going to say which ones I think are, into better justice systems. So I think we have to be very careful about that. I also am going to say, with the greatest of respect, I have grave concerns about the use of that research, which I see as a piece of advocacy, not a piece of research, to support arguments to policymakers. You don't say who the 800 experts are, but my guess is those 800 experts are mainly mediation providers. You ask any provider of a commercial service whether they would like the government to compel potential users of that service to use that service, not many of them are going to say no. So really, it is not a piece of research, it's a piece of advocacy. And I, as an academic, actually took huge exception to it. So I'm sorry, I think you gave a good presentation, but really, it's quite dangerous. The other thing about it is that when you provide your very compelling cost and time-saving data, I know, because I've done the research, the difficulty of actually quantifying the extent to which mediation saves cost and time. Comparing it with fully litigated, adjudicated cases is not the way that you do it. And comparing the outcomes of voluntary mediation and extrapolating from that to mandatory mediation, again, is highly doubtful. It's dubious, it's very misleading. I'm not going to say, well, I would say it's misleading. I also felt that you made the point that a failed mediation may indeed increase both cost and time, and then brush that aside. That is not, if you're having a policy of mandatory mediation, you cannot brush that aside, because what you would be doing is forcing a number of people to increase their cost and time, because the evidence shows that when you compel people to mediate, your settlement rates go down, and that is quite clear to me. So you will understand why, when I read the report, I didn't feel very happy about it. I thought I would be the only person making some of the arguments that I'm making, but actually I heard Lord Mance and Diana make them very elegantly. So I will now shut up.
Thank you. Well, I think we've got certainly a good handover point to a mediator to try and pull some of the threads together.
See why I would never be a mediator.
Sorry, the temperature of the debate has risen, but it's also getting terribly hot.
Yeah, I thought it was just me getting, it's boiling.
There should be, I'll have to ask someone outside if see if they could turn it on. Thank you, John. Sorry about that. I'm trying to Bill.
Centrally controlled.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody else who's gone before. In a way, I have the easiest job, because a lot of the points, like many others have said, that I might have made have been made, and I'll try, if I can, and just make a few slightly different points. It's important, declaring an interest, I think, at the outset, to say that my perspective on this is a mediator's perspective. That's what I do. So I'm not coming at this as a policymaker, although I've spent an inordinate amount of time with policymakers in many countries on these questions. But fundamentally, I think I'm coming at it as a jobbing mediator, someone who's out there doing this stuff week in and week out. And that may give me a slightly different perspective. So a few points then, if I can steer myself to ones that haven't been made. Firstly, the whole question of conflict and our understanding of it and our resolution of it differs widely from place to place in the world. It's really an expression of a culture. It's one expression of a culture. And I do get concerned when the language which is used, I'm not saying it's particularly here today, but in many contexts it is, the language that is used is almost as if this is an export. and we can sell bananas here and there, we can sell mediation systems here and there, and I think that runs the risk potentially of ignoring the subtlety of the requirement for conflict resolution systems of every kind to be an expression of the culture in which they find themselves. I say that, I suppose, slightly conscious that Brits aren't always regarded as the best Europeans, but I do think in any European approach to this, for example, that the scope for allowing for variety and breadth and difference is an important component. That's the first one. Second point is this, it clearly, and this has been articulated by many people, and Giuseppe as well, you led on this comment in part of your presentation, clearly this depends on what hat you wear. If you wear a policymaker's hat, you bring to it, rightly so, a certain approach. I suspect if you wear, for example, a judge's hat, you bring to it the approach dictated by what you see in front of you. I bring to this primarily a mediator's hat. I think, get slightly concerned in talking to some policymakers by the "it's good for you" argument. I noticed somewhere, I think it might have been in your recent article on this study, Giuseppe, the line, "the better approach is an amicable process." And at a human level, and as a mediator, I entirely agree with that. I'm not sure that translates entirely into policy, as opposed to being a personal value, which as it happens, I hold. So I think we need to be quite cautious about saying to people, policy-wise, this is good for you because it'll all help us to be nice to each other. So that's the second point. The third point is this, and it's really a point about the rate of change. I don't think it's overstating things to say that I've been involved in mediation for 25 years, and it seems to me, in the places I've been involved, that the rate of change in the way people think about justice in that short period of time has been immensely fast. So if we just zoom up a bit and take a little bit of perspective on this whole thing, my hunch is that if there is such a creature as a socio-legal historian, I don't know whether there are, but if they exist, they will look back on the last 20 years and the next 20 years, for example, as a time of enormously rapid change in people's understanding of what the delivery of justice means. That says to me that, frustrating as it is at some levels for the many people that people have referred to who are banging the table and say, where are my mediations? I just think that history will suggest this was already a time of huge change. So we can afford, I think, to go slightly more slowly. And that brings me to the final point, which is that the judgment call on this, I think, I think is all about when you make the judgment call. It would be very tempting, for example, to run some experiments, and don't get me wrong, I've advocated this in certain places as well, to run some experiments and then at the end of them look at the stats and draw some conclusions. At one level that's extremely tempting. My hunch is that what we're dealing with here, because it's part of a legal system, a judicial system, which itself is so fundamental to the structure and culture of a country, is that what we're looking for is not whether there's a short-term increase or decrease in mediation numbers and cost-benefit analyses, or at least not only that, but whether this process, after a goodly period of time, maybe 10, 20 years, is respected and accepted as an integral part of the judicial system. I think that kind of perspective on this, for my money, will lead us, if that's the basis on which we're making our judgment calls, will probably lead us to a more sustainable, long-term, and somehow a more solid set of a basis on which we run our judicial system.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. It certainly has hotted up, I think, in terms of the comment, and apologies again for the heat of the room. Possibly there might be able to do something to cool it down. In terms of how I'd like to move it on, I'm going to get ask Giuseppe to respond to some of the points, because he clearly was very involved on the report. But then I think it'd be nice just to also open it up to get a lot of questions from you. I've got Jeremy Tagg here, who's formerly with the Ministry of Justice and was very involved as well in actually sort of the UK's involvement in drafting a response. Tony Allen from CEDA, hugely experienced. Lots of people in the room. I'd like to also to be able to ask questions of the panel, and let's get some comments. Clearly, our colleagues in the USA, I hope you're still here, and any other international. There are mandatory mediation pilots taking place around the world today, and there are some new ones starting tomorrow. So our view is entirely right to be made, that we might feel that there are certain resistances and challenges to what some of the points have been raised in terms of the report and sort of general socio-legal issues. But I think it is right that it has been brought again to a head. Let's reignite the debate and let's talk. So Giuseppe, you had a few people picking holes in some of your survey results. Could I ask you to respond, and then let's have a bit of a debate, ladies.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you all. These are all brilliant comments. I was not expecting anything less, but they also give me the opportunity of clarifying a few things, and I think it's good that we do it now, because otherwise you might be asking same questions, because a 230-page report, which lasted about 6 months and involved 10 people and 816 people, about which I will tell you more about, would not be clear. Let me start from there. It was not, people were invited to comment and refine the survey instrument, which is the key. The survey instrument itself was available on the web for people to respond. We tried to make it comprehensive and short, which, as you know, is a challenge in itself. The reason why we used the survey instrument is because the Parliament was very keen on getting as many responses as possible. A policy decision we made based on the input we received from the about 30 experts, those were selectively invited to help us out, was that if we kept the questionnaire anonymous, we would get more responses. The methodology, how we got there, is clearly spelled out in chapter 2 of the report. So the limits of the report in terms of where the people responded are there. I am at this very moment doing two things. I'm trying to sort out, because not all of the people checked, I want this to be confidential, how many people were lawyers, how many people were providers, and ideally even how experienced people they were. I can tell you even more. When the questionnaire cutoff date came, which was about October, because the report was presented to the Parliament in January, 300 more responses came. So we're in the process of elaborating also those. So these are the limits of the study. The study is not the end of this. I like the reigniting word in that regard. If somebody is to trash, but I don't think the House Against arguments are enough, and I will tell you why, the study, and to do something much better, much more sophisticated, I would be happy. We tried to get the sense of what people thought. We tried to put numbers, how hard as it is, as opposed to say intuitively we know there might be some savings, but we don't know what they are. So that was the limits and the effort of the efforts we did. Other point, very important. We did ask this very question. It was the first question. I couldn't walk you through all of them. Do you think that mediation in your country are enough? And of course, I understand that somebody who's trying to make a living out of mediation would say yes. But what's the alternative? Not to ask the question at all? Well, only 35 people said they are about right. So that is also mentioned in the report. So some people thought that there was no need to foster that anymore. So mediation was not an unqualified good that had to be promoted in any event. But we did ask, anytime you think of a policy decision, for example, mandatory information session, mandatory mediation, or mandatory education, think about the downside. So the instructions for those responding were also to consider the downside of that. And a lot of people warned against the consequences, like lawyers' pushback and other things that have been discussed today. Very important to me, because I'm the author with Professor Mary Trevor about the balanced relationship target and number theory, is not at all about imposing a single percentage on anybody. It is about maybe agreeing on criteria such as the macroeconomic features of a given country, the number of lawyers, how much they charge, the per capita GDP, and other objective indicators. Those would have to be agreed to define what could be suitable ranges and number for each of them. So that is a very important piece of that. With respect to the notion there of whether or not one could interpret that part of Article 1, and Norman says that would not be a proper legal interpretation from his point of view, I think I can agree with him that is a bit stretched, but I would ask him and anybody else to give me an interpretation of what that means. What is a balanced relationship between mediation and legal proceeding? But I would ask him even more. What does it mean in the same Article 1 to facilitate access to ADR, to promote the amicable settlement, and encourage the use of mediation? What do we need European legislation for, if not to produce certain results? Assess the results, not just take them and enjoy them. Okay, so somebody would have to explain that to me. I think to all of the European citizens who support the European Union are expecting from it to have policies that change, actually that better their lives. I'm almost finished, Mike, but this is a very important aspect. I disagree strongly, I would say as much strongly as she did, with part of the report, with the notion that ADR or mediation is not part of the access to justice debate. I couldn't disagree more in that regard, because I believe that justice delayed is justice denied, and I don't know what is worse. Is it worse for people having to settle because legal fees are too high or courts are too unpredictable? Think of countries where only 1% of the cases initiated settle anyway. Or is it more imposing on the people, asking them to sit down and mediate? Think about the economics. The average contribution by litigants to the justice system in Europe is 28%. That is, what the states make out of litigants' court fees, it pays only 1/3 of the total costs. In certain countries like Romanian studies is 13%. In my own country is 10%. And people complain that the court fees are too high. So what would we prefer in Romania or in Italy? That court fees are tripled so that we get to the European average of 30%? Or would we prefer to say, no, the court fees are to go up 800% or 900% in my country so that the citizens pay for the system? I don't know what is a bigger imposition. What is a bigger obstacle to justice? Justice, not to dispute resolution. So that is a question that I leave for you. With respect to the settlement rate, I also disagree, and I would like to disagree with the words of Patricia Bergin, who's a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of New South Wales in Australia. She came to the Supreme Court of Italy a few years back, and she mentioned this. Look, I come from a country where we have a double system. In certain states of Australia, there are mandatory elements, which is not mandatory mediation, but I'll say a few words about that later. In certain states, we don't have that. She may be an advocate, of course, because she believes in mediation, but she's a High Court judge. Well, she said, guess what? The settlement rate is almost comparable. What's more, the satisfaction of the users with the process is also comparable. What's the difference between the states with mandatory and mandatory? Of course, is the sheer number of mediations. So I disagree about that, even though, of course, I can see that wherever the mediation is mandatory or some mandatory elements, there will be fewer cases. And last piece of number that I would like to quote from the report, what would otherwise explain that opt-out process, for example, in foreclosure programs in the United States, have registered a take-up of 70%, 70, whereas opt-in programs have resulted in 20% take-up? Remember the path of least resistance. It might just be a coincidence, right? That those particular programs were so bad that only 20% people took them up. Or it may be something else, that nudging people to do certain things might be a good policy to experiment, to try not to do it. And final, the report does not advocate for mandatory mediation. The report shows, with the limits of the methodology, which is clearly explained, that people active in the field have judged and have considered their own regulation framework not sufficient. Numbers show that where certain policy tools are there, it can function better. The policy tools must be good. I will tell you to my friend Adi, certainly an opt-in system is less effective, I believe, than an opt-out one. And when you say that the information meeting is formalistic, maybe it's a problem not of the law, but of the public administration or whoever is to control that the law is properly enforced, that there are no ways to go around the law. So we need to be clear about what is not functioning. Is it the law or how the law is implemented because of a number of reasons, legal culture, legal system, and things like that. The study, I would conclude, is a piece of research. Its limits are there. It's an idea, and it's an advocacy piece to the extent it's trying to advocate, to think about the emperor having or having no clothes. And I think that in that regard, I stand behind the work of me and many other people in what we conveyed, what we think the study conveyed, and what the study does not convey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. I think in terms of trying to get a bit of a debate going, please welcome you. If you want to ask questions, you just raise your hand. But Lord Muntz, Giuseppe's come back on really the interpretation of Article 1 in terms of the European Directive and saying it's, possibly it is a little bit stretched, but how would you read it from a policy and interpretation level?
Well, I suppose it's unlikely we shall be called upon to construe it, so I might go a little...
Not in this office, in the court. We should go to your court.
I mean, it seems to me that Giuseppe's focus is on all but the initial words of Article 1. The initial word is the objective of this directive is to facilitate access to ADR and to promote the amicable settlements of disputes by encouraging the use of mediation and by ensuring a balanced relationship between mediation and judicial proceedings. The directive then goes on to lay down some limitations to cross-border disputes and the way in which that objective, those objectives is going to be pursued by ensuring the quality of mediation. That's encouraging, it says under Article 4, the development and adherence to voluntary codes, by under Article 5 inviting the parties to use mediation without prejudice to national legislation, making the use compulsory or subject to incentives or sanctions. Under Article 6 by ensuring enforceability of mediation agreements. Under Article 7 by ensuring confidentiality. Under Article 8 by ensuring that those who choose are protected in respect to prescription. Under Article 9 by encouraging member states to make available to the general public, in particular on the internet, information and so on. And then under Article 10 by requiring the Commission to make publicly available information. So there's a clear distinction between encouragement and things which have to be ensured and the overall, those are the ways in which the objective is being pursued, no further. And if we start, I don't really think it helps the debate to start trying to read into mediation directives, things which aren't there. And actually, it has a wider implication, which I've already touched on. I put it in terms of rule of law, but actually there's a practical implication. If one encourages the reading of European regulations or directives to mean things which they weren't intended to mean, it actually makes this country reluctant to opt in to European proposals. It's not good for the cause of Europe. So I think personally that the sense of the directive is clear enough. It's an objective and no doubt a commendable one, but it doesn't translate as a matter of existing law into any conceivable obligation. How would you confine the obligation to cross-border disputes anyway? I mean, do we have to keep records from now on of which litigation before us is cross-border and which isn't, and so on? And if one encourages this sort of interference in national legal systems, you're going to meet quite a lot of resistance. I mean, you might as well then say that there should be legislation to ensure that there's a certain volume of litigation in all countries. I mean, I thoroughly approve of certain measures. I mean, insofar as Europe has curbed costs in the area of environmental law, take Edwards and the Environment Agency recently.
Yes.
That's very interesting and I think very good for access to justice. So I'm not against all intervention, but I do think one's got to be a bit careful.
Have a realistic view. Diana, your take on that, certainly from European perspective again.
I just think it's interesting. I mean, I was attracted to this idea of a balanced relationship. Of course, it is attractive, but you have to bear in mind what has happened when the Commission has tried to go down this road of measuring justice systems. It hasn't gone down very well in this country, as Jonathan has said, because the Commission has already instigated what it calls a justice scoreboard, which attempts to measure various aspects of national justice systems on a sort of voluntary and comparative basis. Our own country, or for better or for worse, has decided to opt out of that exercise. I don't know that I necessarily applaud that. Indeed, I don't. But it shows you how sensitive this is, and because systems are so different, how difficult it is to measure in a way that will either have meaning or will be helpful. It's a nice idea to try to use the existing legislation to up the mediation figures, but I too fear that it would end in tears rather than the result that we really want.
Can I just say, I spent several years on CEPEJ, on the Efficiency of Justice Committee, as a UK expert, and I can tell you it was a very interesting intellectual exercise, but the complexities of trying to make meaningful comparisons, which of course is another reason why I kind of reacted badly to this, because you are comparing things that are so different. You sometimes cannot even get a common definition for something. You have to look for kind of functional similarities. It is so different. The differences between the way the systems operate, the structures, the dynamics, make these kinds of comparisons very difficult, and actually seeking to get any kind of consistency or uniformity in the way that we deal with things, even leaving aside cultural differences, traditions of the different systems. I think it is very, very difficult.
Well, understood, and certainly from a European context, with the mix between the civil and common law jurisdictions, that is obviously going to be an issue. But certainly there have been other experiments around the world with Canada and Australia, New Zealand, America now advocating some of the exploration into mandatory mediation. I mean, if we just try and move on from sort of the pure black and white interpretation of the EU ADR directive, I mean, in terms of very broad principles about the appropriateness of mediation and trying to get an uptake, I mean, I certainly sense that we're trying to separate it and just let it develop slowly. But is the panel very still supportive of mediation to try and get growth in terms of numbers, or was it just a slow evolution that we're proposing?
I've always been hugely in favour of education, encouragement, and I think that it can be very useful in a very wide range of cases. But education, encouragement, facilitation is very different from compelling people to do it. And what was interesting to me in all the many, many pages in this report was the lack of investigation into. You looked at why regulatory measures had not worked, but there was no real attempt to get at why is it, if this is such an attractive service, if it's so much better than litigation, why is it? What is our understanding of why the voluntary take-up remains so low? And I think that's quite a complex question, and it might be different in different jurisdictions. But there was nothing. I was kind of looking for those kinds of explorations in here, and that I think is something that really is worth doing, because if we understood a bit better what the barriers are, if they're barriers, or the reasons why we don't see the voluntary uptake that we ought to see, if this is a service with such high levels of user satisfaction and all those other benefits, if we don't see the voluntary uptake, what is our understanding of the problems in developing that sort of volume? And these are questions that I've been looking at for a long time. I've stopped looking at them now.
just a quick comment on that. It's right. The focus on the regulatory aspect was really in the terms of reference. And of course, that does not prevent you as the investigator to tell your client, the European Parliament in this case, look, this is just a fraction of that. But one has to also keep in mind that certain directions, if not limitations, were assigned. Having said that, I would just respond to this, and I was discussing with this Adi Gavrila, who's also, like me, a fan of education. This I certainly spent most of my time so far, is that even in countries or in states, for example, within the United States, where education or even mandatory education, mediation, and negotiation and other things has been there for many years, you still don't have a very pro-mediation bar. So once again, it's a matter of fact. What is it that has the chance of increasing the number fast? What is the investment that is needed in order for people to get there? If you undo the seatbelt law here, can you imagine that the education, what children learn in school about why they should put the helmet on, will work? I mean, it's a very pragmatic and realistic approach. Mediation has been defined as the Sleeping Beauty, and I think that we may be keeping Sleeping Beauty in a coma if we don't face the reality, outside from idealism, of whether or not human beings are naturally inclined to do the good things, including opting for this certain dispute resolution process over one another. Again, I don't think that this is the solution. No. I said the emperor has no clothes. We know what is not the solution thus far. If that is a goal politically, the one of increasing the number of mediation in the United States, there has been the big debate over the vanishing trial. What is the minimum number, Lord Miles was also mentioning, of judgments that are to be there? These are the argument by the famous two article, the arguments of Professor Owen Fiss, I think back in 1984, 1985. Out of Eden and against settlement. Those were the arguments. You know, society will get loose if we do not have enough legal principles. But where do you draw the line? How many judgments are really needed? Now the trials, for example, in the United States are vanishing, apparently. Mark Galanter has a different opinion about that. But this is going a little too far. But I just wanted to have this particular approach focus on reality. And I understand that trying to interpret the European directives in a certain way might make the UK less interested in staying in the EU, but that to me is less of a concern of, you know, what are citizens expecting, the rest of the Europeans, those who want to stay in. Do you want to commit to try certain things given the others have not worked? That would be, I think, the question that I would ask, and I will ask again the new parliament to consider, with the better research, many more resources involved, and people maybe just publicly stating what they want. But I think I heard Lord Mann saying that certain policies are worth reconsideration, as you said, for example, the one of not extending the limit of £10,000. So I think that in that regard, I certainly agree with you on that aspect, and I think that the whole purpose is, you know, reigniting debate. And ignition means flames and debates and and temperature. So I accept that.
No, thanks for that. Matthew, probably just bring you back into it. But you mentioned earlier on your 2 points quite clearly, that you sort of questioned whether or not actual mediation has failed. And I think your view is, you know, looking at, is it really right to question it as a sort of a substitute for litigation? But setting aside the EU report and directive, the position generally in the US and Canada regard to their experiences regarding mandatory mediation, are you able to just share a little bit of that? I know you touched on JAMS's data collection and their input, but just generally from a
yes
US
and no
point.
is the answer. I have read about various different mandatory regimes in California, in New York, and in Florida, and indeed Ontario. But my personal lack of familiarity with those legal systems makes it very difficult for me to give any reasoned or articulate view on it. I can see, in the case of the Florida survey, for example, that it had run for 16 years, I think, on an opt-out basis, and over that time had dealt with in the region of 100,000 cases a year, and a total number of complaints around 120. and I think you can infer from that, reasonable degree of satisfaction and reasonable settlement rate. From the reading that I did, the context, or rather the trigger for these mandatory regimes is simply pressure on court dockets.
Yes.
It's overwhelming pressure. And it's not people saying, I would prefer a better way of resolving my disputes, I want to approach this consensually, and all the rest of it. It really is just about unblocking.
Yes.
But
that's true of many
and
jurisdictions,
at the same
suspect.
time, produces satisfactory results.
Yes.
So it's not all bad. I mean, one point that I considered making earlier, and was that we've started to think as a panel here in fairly binary terms about mandatory mediation. It's either mandatory or it's not, and we hate mandatory, obviously.
Me too.
But
Me too.
I think the reality is that there is a continuum, and there are a whole range of soft measures that you can employ to encourage,
mitigate it.
Right up some extremely forceful measures. And at least one commentator puts the UK in the middle of that. We're not at the very soft end. We actually have fairly robust systems for encouraging mediation, and my view is that they have been successful, albeit not in the hundreds of thousands of cases yet.
And if I put a question generally to the panel about our existing position in the UK with Lord Wolf's reforms and their cost sanctions and the recent changes by Jackson, would we say that's gone sort of far enough, or is there more work which we should be doing in terms of getting more mediations, if that indeed is the objective, or is it not the objective?
Hardly anything going to adjudication these days, as far as I can tell. If you look at the court statistics, there's been literally, the number of cases actually being determined in court has fallen off a cliff. If you look at the High Court statistics, we clearly already have a very high settlement rate. Those cases that go to court are because it's such a small proportion of the number of disputes. Those cases that go to court are by definition the most difficult, the most intransigent,
yes.
and I believe from talking to judges that they're also the most complex. So you've got an increase, reduction in the number of cases for determination, but an increase in complexity. Clearly, we've already got high settlement rates anyway. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? It's the cost problem.
And time.
And time.
And time is when you settle and how much it costs you. And it's so we have to be clear, it seems to me, that we're talking about attempts to try to settle.
Exactly.
We have always been lured into the dichotomy, the
Thanks.
opposite, that it is ADR mediation is an alternative to civil justice. It's not. It's a handmaid, as Hazel said, to civil justice. It's something that. But the question is, if we can't afford to try cases as readily as we used to be able to, then do the courts take any positive steps to encourage earlier and cheaper
Absolutely.
settlement?
That's all there is.
To weed out the cases that don't have to be tried, to leave the cases that do have to be tried.
Justice delayed.
And that's the opt-out procedure, really, which is what the report has suggested in a way, is it not?
Is the UK system for family, as I understand it, right?
Can I say something on that? I was just going to say, I mean, I think one of the things that that we saw with the introduction of the MIAMs in family mediation is reduction in the number of mediations that takes place instead. Was introduced for legally aided clients a year ago. So we saw a sharp decrease in the number of mediations. And I don't know whether that's something to do particularly with family mediation. That's not an area that I work in, and I don't know if it's something to do with our jurisdiction in particular. But I think we can't ignore evidence that we have about these that are operating here in this country. We also do have evidence on pilot schemes on mandatory elements of mediation and opt-in, which Professor Gill, of course, did years ago. And as she
Lots of evidence,
as she said in her presentation, settlement rates went down when there was a mandatory opt-out and opt-out mediation. The twisting arms pilot. So I think we shouldn't. It doesn't mean that we haven't moved on. And it's certainly time to consider some more research and consider other pilots, I think. But what we don't have is I don't think we're holding on to the information that we do have. For instance, that point about my introduction. And also,
It's an experiment.
one of the things I wanted to say was that we're seeing a lot of reforms in court processes as well. The areas I work in terms of small claims and tribunal cases, seeing a lot of reforms that make those actually a lot more accessible to people. So small claims is a lot more accessible. The European small claims procedures being reformed to make it more accessible, easier to use, and to increase the limit there as well. So I think it's back to what Professor again said. What is the problem we're trying to solve in this country, which may be different, a different driver than other countries have? And I was really taken with what Matthew Rushton said about why are we seeing take-up? Why do we need more take-up? Why are we seeing this as a failure? Mediation is an option. It is available. People can take it up if they like. But I suspect what is happening in this country is the push by mediators to say, by the mediation lobby to say, we need more mediation. That's not the right driver.
A response to that? Lord Mance, any thoughts on that?
No, I've got no particular response, except I've got the government document here about making a court claim for money, and I see that it contains in very simple terms an explanation as to how you make a claim, and then it says a mediation service gives you an internet reference, could be quicker and cheaper than going to court, and that's the introduction to the mediation service for small claims in non-family matters, and I think that is wholly admirable and gives the information and enables people to take it up. And as I said earlier, one could certainly consider extending a mandatory element in the sense of an information or element. One could consider that. I think it requires a further consultation.
Paul at the back on behalf of the CMC, is there something to comment?
One of the things that I think we need to look at, and it's been touched upon, is understanding the blockage, and not just looking at the attraction or non-attraction of mediation, but looking at the attraction of litigation. We've had education and encouragement through from 1999 with the water reforms, a plethora of pre-action protocols, judgments from the Court of Appeal all saying you should go to mediation, you should try it first, and yet despite all that, we still have people queuing up to litigate, and we need to understand why it is that cost-conscious, profit-orientated business people will choose a costlier, riskier process than one that is cheaper. And I'm afraid the answer is in our own psyche, and this is my own proposition here. The litigant, what does the litigant want? The litigant wants vindication, prove that they're right. The judge will see that I'm right. The litigant wants the primordial desire of revenge.
Fight or flight.
That he will get, or she will get in court. The litigant wants humiliation of the other party. That they will get in court, because the judge will wrap the other party up and say what naughty boys or girls they see. What can a mediation information person offer a litigant in that? Are you going to get? Are you going to be proved right?
Okay.
You may not.
Could we just respond to that?
Are you going to humiliate the other side? Probably not. Are you going to get all the money you're asking for? Probably not. It's not a level playing field, and if we're going to encourage mediation, we've got to recognise that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say, is a proposition you're not alone with about the psychic. Behavioral economics, since the Nobel Prize to Daniel Kahneman and Tversky, with prospect theory has shown us how we make bad decisions, especially in estimating future events, loss aversion, risk aversion. Now neuroscience is suggesting that there is a biological base, because MRI systems are able to track the hemoglobin and see which part of the brains are activated by certain stimuli. So it's exactly the thing, fight or flight. And the, education is important, but I think has limits, in addition to not having produced in this country, according to some, certain results. And the question is, should a country starting from zero invest in education or something else? Ideally, of course, you should do both. So this is absolutely the point. If human nature is taken into account, something must be experimented, I think, which is different for what you've done so far. That is the notion. We know what hasn't worked, I think.
Yeah.
I think that perhaps underestimates the value of some litigation in setting standards, in correcting failures, and I think there is a lot of very genuine public interest litigation where people say something's wrong with the system here. Take the litigation about indeterminate life sentences. That's litigation which has been brought justifiably, as the courts have held time and again in various respects, to address the problems of very difficult legislation which perhaps in hindsight ought never have been enacted in the first place. And there were and are areas where litigation with a judgment forms, I think, a very valuable function.
Yes. Another question, Raheem, the panel, please.
Raheem Shamsi, ADR Group. We've been doing a lot of work recently in continental Europe, and this report is very interesting, Giuseppe. And I think you have a difficulty, which is to try and address so many member states and inequality of where mediation is moving well and where it's not even off the ground. And I think one pill for all 28 states is not the answer.
Yep.
But I do agree that we need to move towards a form of mandatory mediation. There are two types, as ADR Group sees this understanding, which is the organic countries and the unorganic countries, where you've had an understanding of mediation which has been flourishing for a while, and as Matthew puts it, do we really need to have it in this country, vis-a-vis some of the countries where it's in the single digits, if not minuscule at all. And I think education in those countries and mandatory information assessment or information meetings is something where the gatekeepers to mediation, the lawyers, need to be removed, and you need to get to the user to let them know this is really an option. That's not even happening in most countries. And so when you talk about education, you're talking about a very diasporic community where people have a great understanding vis-a-vis nothing at all. And I think you need to take it back to an understanding where there needs to be education fit for that member state, and maybe a bit more of an understanding of what culture they have in dispute resolution. But I'm not really sure that one pill is going to fit for all.
Let me respond to that. Thank you, Raheem. I'm totally with you, and if I think I can give you my own solution, it would be to ban the word mandatory, because it does lots of troubles. When I presented the report to the Parliament, a member of Parliament from Germany said, "I'm a liberal. To me, anything which is mandatory is bad." I replied, "Well, it doesn't mean that it should not work." But this is exactly, it is a slogan that everybody's afraid about. I think the MIAM, as I read it, doesn't mention mandatory, so it is required. Something even more interesting is being done, as we understand it, in the Netherlands. It is mandatory with opt-out, but it's not called that way. There is an article which is being discussed, which will say that for 45 types of disputes, it's the longest article in the Civil Code, they said, you are expected to be there, but there is not even the word expected. So it's mandatory in disguise, as somebody said that. It's very important that we have certain things which are inherently, humanly terrifying us, like the snakes or something like that. But in fact, we should be really clear. Matthew was very much on point that mandatory what? Mandatory settlement? Of course not. Mandatory consideration. Now, mandatory consideration can be essentially in two ways. It can be information session, opt-in, or opt-out, which seems to be work a little better. It is to be where it's there as work well, because I'll give you this piece to consider. Just look around the world. Those who have mandatory mediation or mandatory elements, what do they do about it? Are they going back? No. What about those who don't have it? Keep thinking about it, keep thinking about it. I mean, there is some value in this very empirical, very simplistic consideration, I think.
Another question, Graham Ross, please.
Yeah, two points. Number one, we talked a lot about mediation in the context of the litigation and preempting a decision and the issues about what its impact on it has suggested, etc. But let's bear in mind that a lot of mediation brings results and benefits beyond what might have the court may have done. I deal with shareholder disputes, and one recent one where a company that was really being imploded because of the dispute ends up with two companies that survive and out of the economy. Neighbour disputes is a good classic, and that leads me back to my second point,
And this is obviously a value that perhaps the research, an extra value research may not have addressed. But at my second point, we've been looking at it from the point of view of researchers, of the cost to the courts, of lawyers and of mediators. But let's just look at it from the perspective of the party in dispute and the litigant. What is it that they have as an objection to this subject of mandatory? Well, I suppose it is, there's another cost to me, and there's also a cost of delay in the process. I advise Modria, which is introducing online dispute resolution, and I've just been appointed to a CBC advisory group to introduce to look at online dispute resolution in the court system. We're working with the Netherlands courts and legal aid boards in family and neighbour disputes, and what you're getting if you start to look at technology is that barrier or objection of cost. You're imposing an extra cost to mediation in person, and the delay goes away if you simply say to people, when you issue in court and you have email, then this neutral under mediation rules will contact you, and he will try to both facilitate a speedy movement of the court and following of the civil procedure rules, but he would also attempt to help you identify ways to resolve these disputes. I think if you look at it like that way, a lot of those objections to the mandatory aspect would go away. It would just seem to the party as part of the court process, part of civil justice. And I think we need to look at it in this more expanded perspective.
Anyone like to comment on that? Or you agree with that? Jeremy, in terms of your role in this process
I
earlier?
used to be in the Ministry of Justice for a number of years, and therefore was involved in the whole development of the mediation policy, including the small claims mediation service. And I think that was what we were trying to do there, was to try to build in something that was ultimately a part of the court process. So the people coming into small claims, because mostly you're dealing with unrepresented parties in small claims. Now it may have varied, now we've changed the limit to 10,000, but basically they're unrepresented. And I think probably if the court process says we have this available, you know, this is how it works, you know, it's got very high satisfaction rates, give it a go. And at the moment, as things are, it's kind of free, people aren't having to pay anything extra for it, and it works and it settles, and that's fine. But I think it worked there because a lot of the judges were telling us, now they might disagree about this point, but a lot of the cases in small claims are not necessarily decided on points of law.
Right.
You know, it's an issue between two people, and depends how they make their argument as to how a decision would be made by a judge at the end of the day. So I think it was acceptable, and what we were trying to do through that consultation, which was mentioned, was to try to see that expand. So to all intents and purposes, people coming into the court process didn't have to tick a box and say, yes, I would like to try this. There's more a case of, this will be the small claims process, but you don't have to use it. So that, I suppose we were trying to move that into an opt-out, but of course I left the Ministry of Justice and I haven't got a clue what's going on there now. So I don't know what's happening in that school, but I think that was, having visited with Hayes or various other schemes and court-based schemes, automatic referral at Central London, they had limited success. But it did seem it was catching on with small claims. Now I know there might be people in this room that don't think that what's offered there is proper mediation, but it's a dispute resolution process which does resolve disputes to parties' satisfaction. And I think the point that was making here was the fact that it can be very stressful coming to court. And I know when I've been involved in 2 cases myself, you know, admittedly as a defendant, I found the whole process very stressful. And my opportunity was try to get out of this as quickly as possible. You know, can we go to mediation? Can we try and resolve this as quickly as possible? Because I think there might be some people who want to go to court and fight and be vindicated, but I was all about, I want to settle this case as quickly as possible. I'll be willing to throw some money at it just to get the case out of my hair. And I think a lot of people probably are in that situation. They don't want the stress, the hassle of having to carry on with this case. And mediation does at least offer that opportunity. But it's not the only one. I mean, as has already been mentioned, there are lots of dispute resolution processes. I don't think we should always get hung up on mediation as being the chosen one. There are other ones which are, dare I say, cheap and effective to resolve matters.
I think we've already had mention of some of the adjudication and conciliation models, and there's also different processes. I know in ACAS is working very closely on some forms of mandatory meetings sort of pre-issue in the employment tribunals, and I think if we take a step back, the whole structure and existence of tribunals was really created to ease the pressure on the courts, but they're just as full with actions now, and so you do question whether that's even worked as well. Would you like to comment?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I think it goes back to what Bill said, that we're in a process of incredible change to do with how justice is delivered, and it must be, I'm sure it is, I know it's incredibly confusing to be an ordinary person out there looking for a solution to a problem that you have. If you're in a particular industry, it may have an ombudsman scheme, it may have some sort of adjudication scheme, it may have its own internal complaint system. The whole thing is so complicated, whereas before there was a certainty in life that if you had a claim to make, you went to the court, and that was yes. where it was dealt with. Now there are all sorts of things on offer, and I just think it is very complicated, and if mediation, which I believe it does, has a huge part to play in it, it's really got to make its voice heard.
But actually, in that context, I think that a lot of the newer ombudsman services are providing very good services at incredibly low cost, quite quickly, and providing people actually with a determination, which is what a lot of people want. So they get a determination kind of on the merits, very cheaply. They don't have to turn up for a hearing. It's done on the papers, and I think that many of those provide very good services. Yeah, so there are many options.
That is a different option in terms of a mediation alternative, because I think the other question on mediation has certainly been, in my experience, is the question of accreditation and confidentiality. That's one of the central pillars of mediation. If you do have a very big system of mandatory mediation, if we're going to use that term, there are challenges in terms of to what extent do you ensure that the system is correctly handled, and if there are complaints or errors, what are the rights of investigation into the conduct within that proceeding, which is technically within a veil of privilege. So there are issues, but I do accept the point on the ombudsman schemes. There certainly are. We've probably got time for two more questions. I think the lady over there, Richard, sorry, three, on the back. Could I?
Mine's tiny.
That's all right.
Thank you very much for your presentation. What resonated with me was when you said, let's ban the word mandatory. I feel strongly that mandatory suggests that there's an element of choice, that you're making something mandatory and you're removing something else. And the reality at the moment is, with the increase of litigants in person in the court system, as far as I can see, and the litigants in person who arrive at a mediation, is that people can't afford a lawyer. The savage cuts on legal aid have really removed access to legal advice as to whether people have a case or not, and that includes any information about whether or not it's worth mediating their case or not. So in that context, those people, those users of litigation or mediation, are almost being forced to mediate in that context, and that really underlines the need to ensure that if that is what is happening, then that experience has to be as good as it could, with some safeguards, but it is not in any shape or form an answer to what's missing and what's being taken away. And the driver politically seems to be to reduce costs massively by whatever means, and that's risky.
Thank you. I think the last two questions, and then I'm going to invite the panelists to have one very last brief word each in terms of closing. So we've got about 5 minutes. Richard, if
I'll be very short. I would like to ask anybody who's still saying that there should be a mandatory system, how they reconcile that with timing, because any experienced litigation practitioner will tell you that knowing the right moment to pick up the phone to the other side and either start negotiations or suggest a mediation is absolutely crucial.
Correct.
The psyche that they talked about, you actually know the psychology of your own client and try and work out the psychology of the other side in order to get that timing right. The failed mediation, failed negotiation is a disaster. So how can one reconcile mandatory mediation system with the right to the parties and their lawyers to decide when it's the right moment to settle?
Thank you. Gentleman at the back, quick comment, please.
The idea of making mediation a part of the court process is the way to go.
Yes.
I think giving the judiciary the power to order a mediation in the appropriate circumstances might work, because I think it's a way of filtering cases where you have got a litigating person who might have a hopeless case, and a way of filtering out weak cases, and perhaps suggesting mediation at an earlier stage, or imposing a time when the parties might consider mediation,
Yes.
or the judiciary should be given that power now that people can't afford their own lawyers.
Yes, I think they do have certain powers. I think some of the challenges we know is there are inconsistencies with the interpretation of when it's appropriate to refer a case. So I agree with you, but I do sense there is quite a challenge in terms of consistency interpretation. Very last question from a lady over there. Make it quickly.
I've been a solicitor for 18 years and also a mediator, and I very much feel strongly that mediation should be mandatory with an opt-out option, which is very sensible, quite simply for many reasons. We haven't got time to discuss it. Everybody's always made very good points. But the litigant in person and the average consumer or participant can't afford to instruct solicitors and barristers. I think it's a very good, very viable option that should be made available to participants, and really do feel that as a mandatory option, as with an opt-out attached to that, would be the best way forward and a very sensible way forward.
Thank you very much for that. I think, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of closing, I think it's very difficult to draw any sort of specific conclusions and outcomes for this for Diana to take off to the CMC conference. But I would like to invite each of our panelists just to have a quick closing comment, if that's possible. Thank you very much. Bill, could you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, all right, three very quick things. I welcome all the debate and discussion around this issue because it is important. I welcome experimentation as a general principle, not going wild on it, but as a general principle for trying to work out what works best. And I think fundamentally the question really we've been discussing is how, not whether. I think there seems to be, I would suspect, generally fairly widely held view that mediation has an important role to play, not only in legal systems, but actually wider in society as a whole. The question, for me, the fundamental question is not whether that's the case, although others may not share that view, but how one therefore goes about generating that role.
Sure. Thank you very much, Bill. Hazel?
I would say in closing that I don't want to reignite the mandatory mediation debate. I'd like to reignite a debate about how to deliver access to justice to citizens in the current climate. I believe that mediation would have some role in that, but I'm also quite interested in how we're going to ensure that cases actually manage to get, those cases that ought to go to court for legal determination actually manage to get there in the future, because I don't see that happening.
Thank you. Diana?
I could agree with both my predecessors, and I would merely, I think, add to that. We desperately need to do more to encourage greater information about mediation at all levels, from education throughout the justice system, so that people know that that option is available, that it's a possibility that's there, and something that they can moreover feel comfortable with. Yes. As providing an appropriate outcome or process.
Thank you very much. Matthew, could I ask you for?
Yes, I mean I concur with what's gone before. What I might add to that is that I think we need to be equally vigilant about looking at mediation as a product. If as Paul was saying, we're absolutely outgunned by the lure of the courts and vengeance and so forth, then to what extent can we build these things into a mediation process to make that equally attractive? So my concluding point is that we should also look to ourselves as well as to legislators.
Yeah. Thank you. Eddie?
My final comment regards the fact that in 12 years since I started this activity, generations of lawyers and judges have been educated in my country, in Romania, and they are still coming up in a serious state of misunderstanding regarding what this is. And I think that this might be a part of a problem. That's why we are so vocal about it.
Yeah.
So I leave you with this idea. Hopefully we can plan for long terms.
Thank you very much. Lord Mance?
The only final comment I would make is I was very interested in Matthew Rushton's initial comments. With regard to the question how mediation is promoted, it seems to me the judiciary already has power. It has had for a very long time to order parties to use their best endeavours to resolve the dispute by mediation and to stay the proceedings in the meanwhile. There are even, although this has been the subject of litigation, limited sanctions which you can apply, and certainly that was happening when I was at the bar. It's a valuable option which it is actually a lawyer's duty to explain to their clients, and education is of course a very relevant consideration. I am associated with one university in Canterbury which actually has a mediation centre and promotes it actively, and that is wholly admirable. I noted the interesting comment, and with which I agree, that a failed mediation can be a disaster, but mediation can sometimes be used, and I'm afraid I saw this even when I was at the bar, for tactical reasons to suss out the other party's case, and that needs to be avoided. The categories of case in which one might consider imposing some further requirement by regulation, I think would need very careful consideration. We do it in relation to small claims, but there are clearly some cases where it would be quite inappropriate. I don't know whether you're proposing, for example, that all commercial court cases should necessarily be referred to mediation. I think some of them would it would be wholly inappropriate. But that is not to say, as I said, that the judge may not detect, and we did detect in the commercial court cases where mediation would be advantageous and was surprisingly successful. The only final point which relates directly to the survey is it seems to me that the point which has been made, I think, that the comparison of average time and money savings of litigation as against mediation is one based on litigation going to judgment is an important point, and if that is the case, then of course one has to take into account all cases which are begun which settle without mediation and ask what would the effect be on the settlement rate, as I think Hazel Genn was asking. Wouldn't more mediation in certain areas simply be a substitute for settlements? I think it's a research point.
Sure. Thank you very much. And final closing comments from Giuseppe. Thank you.
Allow me two, just one on substance and one maybe more a funny thing, but on the power of judges to order mediation, I think it's very important. It is a part of our the Italian legal system now, and I think I would recommend that as a policy device wherever the opt-out is too easy. I was discussing with my friend Adi Gavrila, and when it's too easy, it's free for people to show up. They'll show up to the mediation center to get the certificate they try, and they'll walk away. If you know that the judge can impose a new mediation again, if you aborted the process by leaving after 2 minutes, then it's going to make people think. It's again a matter of nudging people in the right direction. Having too many comments, I've already taken too much of your time. I want to tell you, as we finish, something you have not seen, because it's before the started. Mike and I and Ian Daniels were talking about the title of this, and I said, Mike said, mandatory mediation, worthwhile experience. I said, Mike, that's not really what the study is about. It doesn't recommend mandatory mediation. It talks about mandatory elements, mitigated mandatory mediation, and it's not the Italian law. Mike said, well, it might be better to spy things up. Well, Mike, this is the last time you choose the title. I want to ban that word forever. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.